Well, thank you so much, Freebird, for that introduction. For getting everybody here who's been in attendance. Good news is you don't have to hear me talk too much today. At this juncture, I really want you to hear from our distinguished gentlemen who are here. Super grateful to have both of you all here. And Freebird mentioned the uniqueness of having you here, and I want to put that out front, right? It's not every day that you have prominent African-American men who are in positions of philanthropy. And so as we talk about some of the problems, but also the solutions, I think it bears repeating that you all do have a unique perspective and one that you bring to the room. And so I think it's only appropriate to kind of begin the conversation there and kind of, just put it out on the table. I mean, you're both African-American men, and you are in philanthropy. And I say and, the emphasis, because it's not one or the other. I would assume that your perspective and how you show up in the world informs the way that you approach your giving strategies and your positions. So can you talk a little bit, you two, about what it means to occupy both of those spaces? We're just talking, we're just a conversation.
So representing the Burroughs Wellcome Fund, thank you, Ed and C and James, for the invitation. And I'd like to just express that I know Tracy's not here and something came up, so thoughts and concerns and prayers are with her. So your question is, you're in these two spaces, and one forces you to kind of have a lens, and that lens is definitely an equity lens. With philanthropy, you have a specific mission, you have a specific vision, and you have a terrain. And across that terrain, you have to apply that equity lens. And we do that through programming, but we're fortunate not only to play in a competitive grant space, but we're also fortunate to play into strategic and ad hoc space. And that gives us a little bit more discretion. In the competitive space, being more formal, through RFPs and that kind of process, you have stated criteria, and of course, you bring perspectives and experiences, especially in a competitive process where you have review committees that make up expertise or representation from the particular community you seek to influence or have an impact on. So I think, to answer your question real briefly, just having an equity lens on, having a certain background and experience, and for me, I'm fortunate, going from an area of writing grants to actually being a grant maker. I'm able to carry both perspectives, in a sense. Not only from writing grants and looking at target populations, underrepresentation, underrepresented minorities, but also from the perspective of how do you carry that in a more formal sense, but still know that you have the discretion and the flexibility and autonomy to play in those other areas.
How you guys doing today? It's good to come hang out with you guys. I want to thank my family as well, my mom and my fiance, for letting me hang out with you guys on Sunday. But when I think about this work in philanthropy, I think about it and how I come to this space. I was born in Inglewood, California. I was raised in Rialto, California, and so I come into the space having personal experience working and living in the neighborhoods, the great neighborhoods that most of us work in. And so the lens that I bring to it is very much so focused on justice. And I think that we have to make that distinction in this space because there's a very different lens to think about philanthropy as charity, which I feel like charity makes people feel really good around cocktail hour, right? Justice is really actually about righting a wrong. Right? And so we have to be able to think about how do we think about bringing communities back into healthy standing? How do we think about the historical context which put them in the standing that they're in to begin with? And how do we think about the philanthropic missions for which these organizations kind of come to? And so Dr. King said philanthropy is commendable, but you have to remember what makes it necessary, the injustices that make it necessary. And particularly when you're talking about the Southeast. You have to have that conversation about where does money actually come from, right? And so I work at the Kenan Trust. And the Trust, I think they've done a lot of great work. And from Tom and all the other folks that work there, and the current folks are working to be on that right side of history, right? But if you look in the past and where that money is stemmed from, we're talking about slavery, right? We're talking about a fortune that was built on the backs of black people. And so we have to have that conversation too, and be really clear about how do we right those wrongs. And so that lens that I work from is one of justice.
I appreciate you mentioning that. I know you've actually written some on that very topic, right? Reorienting our giving strategies in philanthropy. And so I would encourage everybody to please search that out and read that. And you know, the historical piece, which I'm sure at this point people know, I'm a former history teacher, talked a little bit about history and how we got here. But I think you're right in carrying these two things in our mind. On the one hand, philanthropy has done an amazing job, particularly in the field of education, with allowing African American folk, you know, post-emancipation, to get access to education, right? You know, I think about the Jeans Fund, I think about the Rosenwald schools. And so there's a crucial role to play. On the other hand, if we're not careful in our giving strategies, we can reproduce inequality, right? And I think about, you know, the Rosenwald schools. There was only a portion of funding. Those communities who often didn't have, they had to raise the rest of the money, right? So they were still at a disadvantage. So what are some of the ways, what are the right ways, do you think, philanthropy can engage with the communities that they're serving? What is the right way to go about that problem?
I'm going to piggyback and just say real quickly that one of Dorian's products came out that I think our communications officer, Russ Campbell, was probably here today still. I talked to him earlier. He shared with me about the whole collaborative approach with equity and funding. And part of that was looking at how collectively we go to where there's resources and then there's simply not resources, have and have-nots. And in the competitive space with grant making with Burroughs Wellcome Fund, we've started to look at how do our small, rural, low-wealth, isolated communities even compete with our more resourceful communities for funding. And how do you start to make it an equal playing field? How do you get that even start? And one way is for there to be collaboration on making investments in high quality, but then those high quality situations, those high resourceful situations, how do we leverage that to ensure that there's scale and opportunity for the communities of need? So this is a constant balance attempt to ensure that our more resourceful communities connect, pay it forward. With our communities that are low in resource, how do we actually contribute directly to them to build capacity, to reach high capacity? So it's a constant balance, and then in that space, of course, in those low wealth, isolated kinds of situations, comes underrepresentation, and how do we address that? So I just want to make sure I made a point that we're looking for opportunities where collectively philanthropic efforts can kind of address that in a more collaborative fashion, because we preach it. We say, communities, grantees, we want you to work together. And the grantees have every right to say, funders, can you kind of work together? Because we know that there are certain aspects and constraints with your funding, but fundamentally there's something there, and equity is one of them, that applies to everything that we do. So maintaining that lens and having a collaborative approach to it certainly helps.
I think being really careful about who you invest in, and being really thoughtful about being led by communities in those investments. I think to this point, philanthropy has done a very good job of rewarding people who tell the worst stories about communities the best. And so I'll say that again. It rewards people who tell the worst stories about communities the best. And so that narrative is consistently reproduced around the broken community, around the broken mother, the low-income student, the black kid who doesn't have any resources, doesn't have any place to live, as opposed to looking actually at the assets that are in our community. And when you lead with an asset-based perspective, you have a very different outcome, right? When you think about going into a community, you're never starting from zero. There are always assets in those communities, right? They might be under-resourced. It might be a grandmother who's running a program in the bottom of a church. It might be a teacher who is working 15 extra hours on the weekends to be able to make sure her students are passing the test. But there's always assets. So you need to be able to find that table, find those assets, and really think about folks that are telling the narrative in a very different way. And then I think making sure that you're making investments for individuals that are on the ground that are actually proximate to the work. There is a very big disparity in the way that organizations or philanthropic institutions fund organizations, right? And I mean specifically, and this is about race, right? So I have seen and been part of where organizations will fund a white-led institution at $3 million with general operating costs, no restrictions, right? That is very distant from the actual community. Or they'll have organizations that are actually doing the work close to the community and fund them at $300,000 because they're led by an individual of color. And there's actually organizations like that in this room, right? So, William, could you stand up? Atreus, stand up. Ricky, wherever you are, stand up. Jason Terrell, stand up. These are leaders of color who are actually doing this work, who the trust supports, and they're doing it on a super lean budget, right? These should be multi-million-dollar organizations, but when you look across the room, you'll notice one thing about them. They're all leaders of color, right? We need to be finding these type of institutions, asking them what they want to do and investing in them, right? Because then you're actually focusing on communities being the heroes and the heroines of their own story and believing that they can. Thank you guys. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to fight that.
So, but you all sit kind of in the driver's seat to an extent. You all have at least access to the purses to be able to operationalize and make a reality people of color-led organizations. And so I guess I'm just wondering, like, I hate to use the term subversive, but I mean, for lack of a better term, I mean, is there a way to disrupt the current framework as it is? I mean, because I don't think personally, and this is my opinion, that the way things operate now encourages that sort of innovation. So when you take organizations like, the individuals who just stood up, who are doing amazing work, there's also not really an incentive to innovate, right? Because there's the fear of failure. If I do something that's too creative, it may not work. So there's not really the freedom sometimes in the funding structures that we have to really, really do the big and bold ideas. So I guess it's a two-part question. How do you foster risk-taking and innovation in philanthropy, the kind that would really get organizations like those, and I put myself in there as well, to get funded? And how are you leveraging that from your positions?
So I'll give you an example. I talked earlier about ad hoc and strategic. Dorian just recognized a couple of folks in the audience who are leaders and know their communities and know their target audience more so than we do. And they bring a story. So in the ad hoc space, Atreus is a good example. We schedule meetings, Atreus, how many times before we start to kind of put a plan together for how we leverage your assets?
Yeah,
Several. And those conversations continue. So it wasn't a matter of Atreus waiting for a grant maker to come out with an RFP. We built a proposal based on discussion, continued kind of identifying assets across multiple networks. And finally, we went to a space that's probably not the most ideal in terms of making connections, but we brought both parties together and said, how can we leverage each of those assets, and then how can a grant maker come to the table to complement it? So it wasn't a formal grant making process. It was one focused on equity, access, and opportunity, but also having a champion and someone to lobby for that effort, because grant makers can't get too programmatic, even though there's several in the room who might say Alfred Mays gets down into the programs a little bit more than others, but we have to carry that, especially if we're seeking a return. And annual reports or sometimes a formative summit assessment doesn't tell the entire story because they based it on certain metrics. And those metrics may not always fall into what a leader of that particular program might feel as a part of the evaluation. Evaluation might be relationship-based. So we establish a lot of relationships with those local champions, and we reach out and create networks. And I was having a conversation over dinner earlier about how the networks can actually connect. But to build on Dorian's comments earlier also is that we desperately need to map our assets. We need a complete inventory, especially around equity. We're sitting around creating more equity opportunities in silos without knowing that that effort or that activity actually exists, and there's no need to reinvent the wheel. And many of you have heard me say many times, there's two forms of R&D. There's research and development, and there's rip off and duplicate. And both work. Both actually work. So we need to seek out those opportunities. There's no need for us to start up another activity that's exactly like another model on the other side of the state. But if we can leverage our resources, we need to do that.
I think philanthropic capital needs to be very creative about how it's used. It should be risk capital, right? But also for philanthropic institutions, they need to come alongside their partners that are on the ground and give them room to fail, right? And give them room to fail forward, right? Because if you look at it, let's say the Gates Foundation, for example, they're a $400 million foundation, the biggest foundation in the world given in education. That's a drop in the bucket when you're talking about, let's say, a budget of a major school district, right? So you think about the Houston Independent School District, it's about $2.9 billion, right? So as big as philanthropy is or could seem, it really is a drop in the bucket. And so we need to be really thoughtful about how we're investing in organizations. And then being really careful about making sure that we're not mapping our reforms onto communities or onto those organizations. The folks in philanthropy, when I got into philanthropy, it was really interesting because it felt like folks' IQ went up 40 points because they were giving money away, right? That's not how it works. But you find those type of leaders like the folks that I pointed out and ask them what they want to do. And then you follow behind them in finding ways to support that.
I want to mention real quickly, James, you said innovation. How do we innovate? How do we fall outside of this conformity in terms of looking at those issues, whether it's racial equity or equity in general? And one is having leaders, like those who stood up, and others in the room, will know that you can't go to the Burroughs Wellcome site every single time and find every single exact match to your need. But those who are willing to come to the table, have discussions about being a little bit more flexible about what might play within our terrain to have an impact. I'll give the Kenan fellows an example. Is Elaine Franklin still in the room? They brought to me a proposal for how we can leverage Kenan fellows and how we could look at that effort through an equity lens. And we did that. We're sponsoring a Kenan fellow for the 1920 year to concentrate on diversity in leadership and diversity in teaching. And these are STEM teachers for the most part with STEM content, but taking a step outside of the box and say, we can bring high quality resources, high quality teaching, high quality equipment, and put it into a classroom. But if our kids in that environment is not receptive, then it's not just gonna happen. It's not osmosis, just put it in, it's gonna happen. How do we incubate it? How do we actually bring about that stickiness with high quality resources with a less than ideal situation? So bringing some of that innovative kind of thinking around how do we address diversity, not only in leadership, not only in teaching, not only in the corporations that we love to see representation equally. Just thinking outside the box. There's a couple of examples I can give you with other programs. One, for example, is, and this is Shane's plug.
Sure, absolutely.
ncraceproject.org is something that Burroughs Wellcome has created as a landing page for the race project that we've created around bringing the race exhibit back to North Carolina. It toured the Triangle area for 6 months, 7 months. I mentioned it back in August. And I mentioned Dr. Flood and his effort to kind of reinforce the need to bring safe and brave space around the discussion of race. And the science of race did that. So Burroughs Wellcome made an investment, and we said when the trailer picked up the product and left the state and went on tour, the conversation shouldn't end. So here we are in an innovative kind of space to say, what does race have to do with the Burroughs Wellcome Fund or some of the other philanthropic organizations where they may have a mission and vision that's not quite tied. You know, Dorian mentioned justice, and we're talking education equity and access. But the science of race will allow us to actually have a conversation about, are we so different? And then build on that conversation. So I asked everyone in the audience to go to ncraceproject.org. It's a partnership with the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources in our effort to bring the race exhibit back, to either host it in its current form, scale it so it travels the state, or add content to it and put a North Carolina spin on it with our own issues, our own concerns, to tell a story, to bring about facilitated discussions around race. We don't have to wait for a panel discussion with a group like this to have those conversations. And we need it to happen in the communities.
Absolutely, and you know, maybe a dead giveaway, but that's one of my favorite topics, right? So, talking about race is hilarious to me to an extent because I always notice how it sucks all the oxygen out of the room. Like, this is like a the gas, and people freeze up. But I feel like it's like anything else. The more you talk about it, the more you develop the muscles. And after a while, it's like talking about the game last night, right? It's just something we become accustomed to. But on that note, I've noticed that in education spaces, but broadly in philanthropy, there is an increasing comfort in having conversations about equity, right? That term is starting to make its way around, and people are starting to get a little more familiar with it. I haven't seen yet a similar comfortability with talking squarely about race, or even funding efforts that deal with race specifically. So this is a two-part question. The first one is, can we do equity work without addressing race? And why do you think funders may have been slow to fund projects that call out the influence of race and ethnicity?
So I think I'll start off. I think one, you can't have a conversation around equity without talking about race. You can't have a conversation about any of the work that any of you guys are doing without having a conversation about race. And we use buzzwords, we talk about, we'll say low income or free or reduced lunch. You guys have heard everything, right? What we're really talking about, we're talking about black and brown kids, right? We're talking about black and brown families. We're talking about black and brown communities, right? That systems have not served well. And so we have to be really clear about that. We have to name that. And so we're having a conversation around race, and you can't get around it. I think that the field has been very slow because of who was leading in the space. And right when I came into philanthropy, usually was the only one around the table, only person of color around the table, usually the youngest, and I would be at a table with 65-year-old white men. Now, for all the 65-year-old white men in the room, I love you guys. Be cool. Shout out to you guys. I love you guys. But I think that also brings a very unique perspective and voices that are not in the room, right? And that leads to decisions that might be well-intentioned, but not always feel comfortable having that conversation around race. I am a strong believer in my faith. This is why I do this work, and I lead with my faith. And so I also have to lead with love and compassion. And so to have a conversation around race, you also have to have a conversation around love and compassion. And realizing that this public kinship and the work that we build, the bridges that we need to build, you have to have patience, compassion, and love to have those conversations. And without that, we're not going to get anywhere, right? And there's going to be mistakes made in those conversations, right? By both sides, because we're trying to figure it out. Yeah.
Go ahead, continue.
But we got to figure it out. And so we got to have those conversations. We got to have them often. And we have to be able to honor those. But also we have to act on them. So we have these conversations around equity a lot. And what I find is, in these organizations, we really use equity as an add-on, right? So if you go into some of the schools, we have an office of equity, right? It's one person in the back room, a black person or a person of color who doesn't really have any positional power in the organization. You show me your budget is going to be your moral document to me, right? So where you spend your money is what you care about. And if your equity office only has $60,000 committed to it, I don't think that you care about equity. I don't think that you care about having a conversation about race, and I question your commitment to communities, right? So we need to be thoughtful about that. We need to think about that. But again, we always need to work with love and compassion when we're having those conversations and lead with it.
That's a huge point, Dorian. I talk to several organizations, and the first thing they say is basically we're going to send a diversity or equity person over to you. But when they come, it's not necessarily someone who can make decisions and act fairly quickly and has the autonomy with that organization to make those decisions. I think we need to elevate that role within these organizations, probably a little further.
We say not even just in that role, but it needs to be everybody's responsibility in the organization, right? This is fundamentally what we're about. This is what our mission is entailed, right? And so it's not just the equity officer that's going to show up. We need to be thinking about how that plays out in our classroom, how that plays around in our curriculum, how that plays around in central office. What does that look like around our engagement with our communities, right? Like it's not a one-person job; it's an institutional job, right? And if we don't approach it that way, we're gonna get but so far, and we're going to. And I promise you, and this is what happens: we continue to create outliers and thinking that we're having success, as opposed to really making systems level change. And I'm sorry, I didn't cut you off.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I think that, as you said, it should come with kind of an institutional and a cultural kind of strategy. But not everyone across those layers can deliver that message upward through the different chains of command or communication. And if the diversity officer, the equity officer is lateral and not necessarily in a position of authority that could start to use that information and act on that information, and everyone feels comfortable with that person representing that message, I think that's a very different position, because they can create that culture and create that community, and they have that autonomy to do that. I just think that if the diversity office is buried 2 or 3 departments under the CEO of the organization, or the president of the organization, that they too have to carry a message through a filter that might not reach the leadership in the right way, or operate across the organization to have an impact and influence. So, as we say, culture eats strategy every single time. And you make those investments in strategy, knowing you're never going to change the culture. And we need those local champions to be there to do that.
I want to take the opportunity to ask y'all for some advice, shift gears a little bit, right? Already given us a treasure trove of information, but for organizations out there that are wanting to tackle equity from the perspective of those in grant-making spaces, what sort of advice would you offer them? And then, if you have anything to offer fellow folks who are in philanthropy, and you already alluded to some of this, who are changing the organizational shift or trying to direct their funds to impact equity, what would you say to them? What sort of advice would you give to both of those stakeholder groups?
For me and peers within funding,
Yes.
I would say, let's join. Let's become collective in our strategy. Over the past year, I basically used an example of some of our funders say that, well, I know equity should be an issue, but I'm really focused on literacy. It's still an equity issue. Or I'm focused on low performing schools, as we did in study group 16 with racial equity, low performing schools, trauma and learning. You and I know quite well, James, that all 3 has equity and race as a part of that thread that goes through. So the funders come forward and says, well, I really want to get low performing schools or trauma and learning, and the funding sort of benefits, and I think that's the status now. We have funding in trauma and learning. And racial equity is still sitting out there isolated, separate, but it's fundamental to the other 2 areas. And we're trying desperately to figure out how we can collectively know that equity and racial equity specifically is the foundation. And if the foundation doesn't meet code, we can build these pillars of literacy, we can build these pillars of achievement gaps and all these other pillars, but if it's built on a faulty foundation, then we're not investing wisely. Because at some point, we're gonna have to address that foundation that has not met code, and those levels start to fall on top. So I just hope the funders can come together. There's several of us that have kind of given ourselves a label. One with Smith Reynolds has joined me on the RACE project to start to kind of seed that initiative. And several other funders, based on the previous discussions we've had, have come forward, and they're waiting on a feasibility study to be completed. So really, RACE is to kind of create a level set so that we can concentrate on these pillars and know that our investments are being spent wisely, and we can see returns on those investments without going through the continuous cycle with a faulty foundation.
I would say be very thoughtful about making holistic investments, right? Tom and I do work in Southeast Raleigh with the Southeast Raleigh Promise. What I mean by making holistic investments, thinking about the investments that you make at home, right? The investments that you make in your own kids, the investments that you make with your families, right? You bet on your house, you bet on your job, you bet on your health care, you make these bets, you bet on the education system, But when we get out and we're talking about communities of color, and we're talking about making those investments, we'll say, well, we only do third grade reading, and that's all we do. And you know what? I'm going to close the poverty gap or the achievement gap because that's what we're going to do, right? Or we only do housing, we only focus on this small segment. And it's okay to have things that you focus on, but you need to think about who is the other person that makes those investments in housing. Who is this person that makes the investments in public health? And how are we working together to make sure that we're making holistic investments in our communities? There's no silver bullets to this work. And how do we make sure that we're making, again, the same type of investments in the things that we know actually work in our own households, right? I had a group that came to me the other day outside of the state that said, you know what, we're gonna do a study on why the achievement gap exists. Are we still at that point? I don't think so. We know why these things exist, right? We know, we also know what works, because chances are it's working at your house, right? Now I would challenge and say, do we actually have the will to make those changes, right? And it goes as far as we actually have the will. I'm gonna wake up and say that, you know what, I'm willing to sacrifice my reputation, I'm willing to sacrifice my time, I'm willing to sacrifice my safety and my security because I believe in justice. And that's what it comes down to.
And for the organizations out there that are trying to acquire investment, what sort of advice would you give for them?
Come talk to me. Hang out. I mean, I think, and I'll stop talking in a minute. I think for those organizations, for me, it's very much so about narrative. It's very much so about the story that you tell. You can only treat somebody as good as you talk about it, right? And so I'm not taking applications anymore. I'm not taking that talks about communities of color as anything but brilliant and amazing. And that doesn't mean that we're covering up the challenges, but I'm not looking to hear that anymore. We have to have very accurate narratives about the communities that we serve. And so if I get something across my desk like that, I'm not paying attention to it. And so we need to be really clear about that. And we need to have something that we stand on, right? Real quick exercise. Can you guys, everybody look at the person next to them.
You can see them?
I can see them. Does everybody follow the person next to them? Look at them, right? All right. Now I want you to tell me everything wrong about that person. And I'm joking. That's an exercise that Training Shorter does at DME. But if you think about it, it's wrong to describe anybody by their deficits. And that's what we consistently do. And so, one, think about the narrative. Think about what stories are you willing to tell about the communities and the people that you work with every day. Because again, it matters. I would say also make sure that you're finding the tables in the communities of folks that are already doing the work. Make sure you're finding the leaders, like the ones that just stood up. Ask them what they want to do. They know what's going on in the community. So making sure that you're aligning with them and how do you support them and get behind them to do this work in a very collaborative way. And so when I see a grant proposal or something like that, those are the things that I'm looking for. One, how do you open it up? How are you talking about people? Two, are you getting proximate? And three, do you have that matching the investment? And do you really believe in the work that you say that you do?
So there's a couple angles I'm going to share. One is systems and systematic structures created inequities. So why aren't we thinking systematically around structures to create equities rather than the siloed approach or those holistic investments that Dorian referred to? So I'm going to go back to the notion of, based on systems that we've created STEM ecosystems, communities that are leveraging their assets and prior investments. So we're starting to use the language of, we no longer see them as awardees or grantees, we see them as assets. So we're changing the language so that the ask and you all know you shouldn't make an ask of yourself, right? The ask should be with a match, in many instances, whether it's in kind or you've leveraged a prior investment. So that starts the conversation. What can you give along with coming with an ask? How are those resources, those private investments been, again, reinvested across other networks? That takes the discussion. We're not at a point yet where we've cut out the application process, but we are at a point where we're being more prescriptive about exactly what we're looking for, rather than allowing it to go all over the place and then have to bring it all the way back in to say, but what are we actually trying to do and what kind of impact we're seeking to have? But I think it takes a community of philanthropy to leverage our resources with each other, whether it's the expertise that Dorian has and the strategy that he's adopted and how do we leverage that, or whether it's our ad hoc and our strategic vision that can leverage some of the resources and the investments that he's made. I'd love to know and have an inventory of where his investments have been so I can complement and supplement. You mentioned earlier, Dorian and I go back to the pie concept, that many of our organizations that we target to support, they go down each slice of pie and they get a no in response because it doesn't quite fit the mission and vision of that organization. But if each slice of the pie, we're communicating with each other, and even though I'm constrained by that mission and vision, I can say Dorian is concentrating on justice and some other issues, and I can complement that. I might be able to see around equity where he might be able to focus on justice. So it doesn't result in it being a no. It's more of how can we collaborate and make that particular opportunity work. So sometimes we have to tell someone, I'll get back to you, and it's not I'll get back to you for you to go through some kind of bureaucratic process of coming back with a more formal application. It's more of how can I talk with my fellow funders to figure out how we can help you and identify a mechanism of some sort of, maybe I do the seeding, maybe we do the stand-up and building capacity, but we don't do sustainability. But there's an organization, there's a funder that might say, we don't take risks, we're not that innovative and creative, but if you bring that lesson learned and that model, we're willing to do sustainability. So we're having those kinds of conversations.